But that's kind of
Okay, thank you, Aparna. Uh, Welcome, Andrew. Welcome, Tariq. Good morning to both of you. I'm delighted to be welcoming all of you who are here for the wonderful conversation that promises to be very exciting here. And I'm privileged to be introducing one who doesn't need any introduction, Tariq. I'll begin with Tariq and then also introduce Andrew, our guest for the day. TK, as we call him lovingly, TK has been a Thai charter member, New York chapter for the last 20 years, and he's now on the global board of trustees. And I think what makes TK extremely valuable is that TK is the pillar of strength for the education initiatives at Thai, including the SIG. To give a couple of bullet points of introduction about TK, he spent a few hundred years in the corporate sector before becoming an entrepreneur way back in 2005, and his corporate life was international with many leading Fortune 500 companies. And he first founded a company called Game 24 by 24 Cross 7, and that was done with PhD students at NYU. He was the CEO running the business for initial few years before the co-founders took over. And since then, TK has been extremely active in the space of mentoring, angel investing, and is now a venture partner at Elevate Capital LLC. TK, welcome. I'm sure we're going to have a great session today with you as the host. And with TK, we have a very dear friend of mine, and now a very dear friend to Thai, Andrew. Andrew is a globally traveled um, entrepreneur with three of the largest tech organizations that you can imagine: Microsoft, uh, Amazon, AWS, and prior to that, Samsung. And after almost 2.5 decades plus of corporate experience, Andrew has turned an entrepreneur with a beautiful, lovely idea, and his company is called Kuvax. The wonderful thing about Andrew is, and that's why I quite like the title of today's session, is that he's been an entrepreneur in large oceans, three oceans that I've just named. I've, I was a customer of his. We met at a couple of conferences, became very good personal friends. And just to illustrate one point about the entrepreneurial energy of Andrew, he traveled from his home to Mauritius for a 1 hour session. And what made him come there was the whole idea of being able to understand the exciting entrepreneurial ecosystem evolving in Africa. And the only thing that I could do to sweeten his stay was that I said, Andrew, you come with your wife at your expense. but we can have a great time on the beaches of Mauritius. That's Andrew for you. Phenomenally knowledgeable about education, not just in North Americas, but Asia, Southeast Asia, India, and he was the global managing director of Amazon Educational Initiatives globally. That's Andrew for you. With this introduction, I would hand it over to TK to take this forward from here. Over to you, TK.
well. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Hundreds of years, yes. We're all looking for that pill, or maybe not, right? But Andrew, thank you for being with us and our guest today. Just to get started, I do not want the title to be a bit of a misnomer. I mean, Andrew is joining us with broad shoulders. He has so much experience across in different sectors and depth of experience. and we're going to be benefit from that. So although his current initiative is a startup, Kuvax, he has worked as a giant within the giant company. So I think we're going to be benefiting from perspectives across the board.
Thank you. Appreciate the introduction.
So tell us, what is Kuvax and where did the name come from?
Well, thank you for the introduction, and Satya, always a pleasure. And Satya and I do go way, way back, and he has indoctrinated me to understand a lot of the knowledge, definitely in India, but even with other ed techs and being an entrepreneur, a very successful one for himself. I've also learned a lot from Satya. TK, Covaxa, where the name, quite frankly, there's no mystery. It was just sounded kind of okay. I wish there was much more of an elegant way of saying it. What led me to Covaxa was really during the COVID situation, where I did have the benefit and fortune of working for some pretty large companies, but I was always more core to my own passion about really wanting to improve education through technology. And so it may sound like I didn't have a chance to hold a job for long because I've moved around several times in the past decades. It was that core passion. And during COVID, I felt almost like this helplessness. I was getting phone calls, Tariq, from all over the world. Even I reside in Virginia, but even the local school districts were having challenges. And I felt that I wasn't successful. With all my multiple decades of convincing school districts and leaders to adopt technology for ultimately this type of, not an event, but a future where learning was much more digital and non-traditional than what we have been accustomed of how we went through education. And when COVID hit, I would say, as painful as it was, there was a silver lining. And I wanted to be a part of that change, not just about the technology, but now how can I, with some of the backgrounds that I have, policy, government, big company, small company, investment, how can we then further accelerate it so we don't go back to the old education standards in the way it was? And so that was more of a passion. And Quebec says about providing advice, consulting, helping ed techs, as well as helping governments, districts, and leaders to shape, I would say, our future of what our education should look like.
Good. I mean, there's no turning back. As one of our prior speakers said, the genie's out of the bottle. So it's going to be a hybrid and blended learning formats. And, we're going to move to sort of your background a little bit to see how your thinking was informed. But before I do that, can I ask, Kuvaxa is like your main thing, nobody does 40 hours. We're all doing 60, 80, 120 hours as needed, but that's your main thing, right?
That is my main thing.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
Good. So by way of background, I mean, we have the luxury of picking up, the investment angle and the corporate angle. Let's start with the investment angle, because you've, invested yourself and you've engaged with people who are big time investors, whether they're private equity groups or venture guys and so on. And all of you guys and like all of us, we're all kind of trying to understand the space. COVID is, of course, a big factor, but things were happening well before COVID anyway. So walk us through some of the learnings and, discoveries and insights you have from an investment standpoint, which is, put money in and get even more money out.
Absolutely. And I would definitely say that the first calls I got were actually from the investment community, be it a venture capital or private equity. In that March, February timeframe of last year, I think there was clearly a big realization as the economies came to almost a sudden halt globally. A lot of investors were unfortunately not doing so well because many of their assets and investments were in the retail sector or whatever have you, the traditional, and they were quick to adjust and go, okay, we need to shift their assets, investments, and look differently. And the calls I were getting is, hey, we're thinking about getting into healthcare, education. Can you tell us more? And so I'll share with you what I believe is what they are thinking. And I say they in a general sense, especially for you, the younger entrepreneurs are thinking of where do you think the monies are going to go? And I say education, I'd say there's at least four kind of big topical areas where technology and the shift of this market is going. I'd say it's reskilling. I think there's no doubt, and this is definitely for sure in the US, but also in other parts of the world where education has always been time-based, degree-based, or degree-centered. When I say time, how many times are you sitting in the attendance? The funding mechanisms was really much anchored around attendance. We know that COVID that no longer is really the important case. Number two, the degree. People start to question, is this really worth this amount of money to go to that particular university online? And so, because as the economy right now is still starting to just recover, a lot of people want a good job. And so am I making all these investments, and the realization of all these education skills is now becoming really the pervading type of asset that is being demanded upon, not just by the employers, but now the education system is waking up to say, wow, we have to align much more quickly. They were already in motion, as you said, TK, but skilling is now shifted very aggressively toward it. I'm not saying that's the only reason you should get an education, but skills. And so from a skills, what's the technology stuff that you should be concerned or look at? Assessments. There's a lot of online assessments and ensuring that you have those competencies. And the traditional way of just taking a test, be it these high standard tests, are still there, but it's going to be now more in question, and now more credentials and certifications are becoming a little bit more of a premium. And so understanding what those are, and they don't always have to be technology driven, even though they're the higher paying one, but even conversations in schools about micro-credential of skills. Is TK or Andrew a good presenter? Has he or she just demonstrated competencies in working in teams? So that is really becoming that particular space, and you're going to start to see that evolve. The second thing is, and it's probably an obvious one, is are every institution ready to be fully online and really make it an authentic learning environment? Because how you measure individuals and students of engagement has changed. When you're in person, you get to see a lot more different types of attributes that someone's paying attention, they're engaged. The way you administer curriculum in person will be different than online. And so curriculum are going to be now looked upon differently. Educator professional development is now being revisited to ensure that online is a core fabric of that. And then you got other technologies underneath that, even the devices, the management of it, security is now becoming important. People realize, or if you don't, bad attacks, ransomware, cyber attacks have gone up 5 times, and they're becoming more malicious. And so even those type of even IT sectors are looking to acquire to round out that area. Cloud is going to be important now, because even when I was with Amazon and understanding where Microsoft, Google, and all these other big players are going, it was always tough to market to cloud, to a lot of education. Yeah, I'll pause there. Yeah.
So, some of the things you mentioned about changes in the way skills or credentials are recognized, and even policymakers are seeing, like, one of my favorite things was Linda. We all know Linda. You kind of pay a few bucks and you get all the courses you want, and they do accreditation. Now, have the companies accepted those accreditations and so on? But the underlying point here is that a lot of these things take time to take effect and then show results and outcomes. And the investment community, they like accelerated timelines. Of course we like, put the money in and get it out very quickly. And historically, the education sector tends to have a long lead time in terms of something maturing and developing. And that's why capital often goes to other sectors where, there's a quicker return. So did you not encounter some hesitation in trying to come into grips with all of these changes that are happening before putting money in it?
Absolutely. But I think the short answer is yes. Education, people think it's easy to do business in there, but I think for many of those that are in it, it's actually pretty difficult, because you're dealing with a lot of the long sales cycles. you're dealing with a lot of the procurement, the transparency, and then student data. There's always sensitivities when you're, doing things around student and data and information. But what's changed though, TK, is they're now looking at it as they have to get there. So it might take a little longer, but this education system is not going back, as you mentioned. And so it's just a matter of which are the areas that they will want to invest that get the quickest ROI. But the market size, if you look at the total addressable market of education, 1 in 7, every individual on this planet is a learner. Just absorb that for a second. That's almost 1.5 billion individuals on this planet is an education prospective customer. So be it K-12, be it adult learning, and education, TK is no longer just to postgraduate. It's like K to gray. So now as this lifelong learning is becoming, so the addressable market, I think, is also very attractive to folks. But you're absolutely right. They're not going to invest in things that may take 10 years to realize. But also because of this COVID and this digital learning environment, the accelerants of adopting into technology has almost been forced upon education in a bad way to say it. The good way to say it is we all know that education needed to change anyway, and this is now moving the ball faster toward that. So I think there's always that fine balance.
So two things from that. One is that the relative influence and drive from policymakers and public institutions and government, that's going to drop, right? The relative importance of that. Because if people are questioning what's the value of that, structured way in that timeline to get high school and middle school stuff, right? I mean, it's going to be there because you're saying it's cradle to grave. So the proportion of learning and education that happens outside that is going to be much higher. Is that kind of roughly true, or am I exaggerating?
No, I think there's, if I understood your question right, yes, supplemental learning outside the education system, definitely in other markets it's even bigger than public education. But the politicians, you also have to look at it. They also realize that the education system not being so resilient has also impacted the economy. Right. And so there is going to be movement that the politicians will push because our economics are actually contingent on it, because we're seeing across the board, even women are not, the employability, they're not getting out to the occupations. And it may sound terrible because somebody has to always, the daycare systems are not always resilient to it as well. So these challenges are out there. Politicians want the economy to move. And so getting this education system right is actually connected to many other areas as well. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that is.
Well, you did. I mean, look, in India, they just issued a 700-page national education policy document, which we discussed in our group. And, a lot of findings there. People are saying, well, it covers a lot of policy, but not actual action. We can debate that. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. Basically, you're saying that influence is not going to go away, and you better stay close to it because you could have opportunities popping out. It makes sense. But then let's touch on one other thing that you talked about, which is colleges. So why spend $70,000 in a college for something, right?
Yeah.
That trend's not going away. Like if somebody were to ask me, would you hold your kids back from going to a top college? I would have to find a very good reason to do so, right? If they had a burning fire inside them to, do something, fine. Otherwise, yeah, that's the model. That's not going to change anytime soon.
No, I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. And then like, as many people know, definitely in good other US part of the country, of the world, education is a money. It's a for-profit driven, and often, and enrollments dictated. So education is almost becoming consumerized, if you will, to TK, where I could get a good course in data science, but it could be online. Do I really need to be in that particular school or university full-time in order to get that? So that is actually shifted sort of the way now educators have to now educate, but also institutions have to offer and distinguish and differentiate themselves with other ones, because the borders have become much less rigid from, physical presence, if that makes sense. And that's where you're seeing even enrollments increase with a lot of online providers, and some who may not have that extreme differentiator, enrollments are going down, and that's forcing the economics. Almost, the market forces are driving education to change as well.
Right. And when that came up several months back in one of our talks, a little spin-off was the lower level colleges, if I can put it that way, that are losing enrollment. They will have a lot of classrooms and auditoriums available for rent and for use, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to have to think about that, because it's like the square footage is just not going to be used.
Right.
So let's move on. I think in terms of policy, before we go to the corporate experience of what you did, any insights from the PE world of VCs, like where they're putting in money right now?
I believe they're looking for clearly the ones and the organizations that they feel that have a lot of already adoption. And so I would say that's where you're seeing some very successful valuations, especially in India, where you're seeing I believe the highest valuated ed tech company is in India with Baiju, and you're seeing the mass adoption of ed tech, private equity and VCs looking for the next big one as well. And so that's where you're seeing, we'll call it these fragmented, smaller ones, drive a lot of valuation. And there's a premium on data. Any ed tech that is looking to address, we'll call it predictive type things. There's a few of them out there, but they're not as always mature. Seeing a lot hunt for those. Jobs and anything cloud-based are also very much resilient out there. So if you are, hopefully all the entrepreneurs here are built on top of the cloud. If not, I'd say you must do that. But you're seeing a lot of them now shift toward that type of platform environment. And so that's almost a given now. So I would say any of those type of things, you've got all your LMSs and all those out there. There's already the larger players, but the niche ones, video-based platforms are also becoming much more prevalent than your traditional learning management system. So those are the ones I would say is the new era of learning. And that's where the private equities are probably spending a little bit more time than others.
Got it. So I'm sure you had very, happy, interesting, good years at Amazon and Microsoft. So just looking at that, I mean, was a lot of what you're doing pure research and development, like come up with education models, or was it more execution?
Both. In every one of those businesses, and it's important for a lot of the young entrepreneurs to know that, the clear motivations for many of these big organizations is obviously to grow their business, gain market share. And also there's an element of philanthropy when it comes to education. So not everybody is this big corporate raider just wanting everybody to use their stuff only. However, they also realize that the big organizations sometimes often fear the smaller ones. And I know that may sound very contradictory because they don't want to be disrupted. They also realize that somebody else can be the next big thing, and keeping a mindful eye on those. So they have massive investment buckets. They can afford to leverage some additional resources and marketing. So always reinventing and creating new offerings. And just to give you a couple examples of, just one at Amazon, I worked with a lot of the Alexa team to ensure that the next modality of learning was maybe perhaps voice-based. And so we created a lot of assets, a small team, to see if there's ways to connect learning to be voice-driven with the next delivery of natural language processing through voice. And so those are the type of things that I think big companies can do, but they also look to partner. So I think that's also an important part, to team up, but they're always trying to reinvent themselves, to not just compete with one another, but also to stay very relevant into the market.
Right. I mean, the availability of resources must be phenomenal. Like, let's say you have a conversation with somebody in the C-suite and say, hey, this is the latest thing. Pouring in $15 million would be nothing, right?
Well, yeah, sometimes it's always not that. It's not like they have $15 million laying around to use it. They're probably sometimes often the most frugal, even if they have a very large, we'll call it market capitalization. but they do have that opportunity to invest, and not just even money, TK, but people. They have a bench of data scientists, they have a bench of developers, or an extended ecosystem of partners that may want to involve themselves in that development efforts as well. So having the market research, the presence, as well as the physical personnel to also do that, I think, yes, they definitely have a lot more accessibility than maybe some of the traditional startups that are out there. But they also don't always have the best ideas. So they always are looking to either partner, build, or acquire for sure.
So did you find that kind of finding talent, nurturing talent, and getting stuff produced, was that particularly different to what you do today as a sort of
Oh,
founder
yeah.
entrepreneur?
For sure, because you had divisions I could tap into when I'm in a corporation. You had an R&D, a product division. You had a marketing division. You had a legal division. As an entrepreneur, that may be one person. All those functions may be embodied in one person, or you have to go find an outside external consultant or somewhere else, and then you have to pay for it. And so there's always challenges of capitalizing and ensuring some of those bets for sure. That's no doubt a challenge. But I would also say the startups, the younger, small companies have advantages as well. I think some of those are the speed and agility, if done right. They can move much faster than a sort of a big organization.
Right. So in terms of looking at the education landscape, is their perspective particularly different to the way VCs and private equity look at it, or it's more or less aligned?
There's a slight difference, I would say, because I can't disclose in detail, but even when I was in the couple of the big companies, two in particular, we looked to acquire. There were certain elements of the offerings I felt that were deficient or it just didn't exist, and it would take too long to build. But the way a private equity would look is almost like this multiple, right? What's your valuation, your cash flow, and then you put an 8 or 10x multiple, and the rule of thumb everybody's familiar with. Big companies, it's like, if I do this, how much more can I market and sell, not of that one company, but how does that organization or that technology force multiply some things that I may already have that I want to further accelerate. So the output is slightly different, but ultimately it does come down to everybody wants the best technology and the people, or a business model that company has for sure when they look at either acquiring, partnering, or even building on their own.
And how do you see the intersection between hardware devices and pure software play? I mean, gamification started like 40, 30 years ago, right? And of course, that's big, and education and tablets or Nintendo's is happening. So are there some insights there? The actual having the infrastructure, or specifically the hardware device, that must be a huge advantage, right?
It's a big advantage, but it also comes with a lot of big, I think not challenges, but big different ways of business. And I give you a perfect example. Even in the hardware world, it's extremely difficult. You just can't flip and discard a hardware. Sometimes you can do just with code. Not that you would want to throw away code. There's inventory. You have to deal with inventory, week of sales, a very different lingo when you're in the hardware world. And then you have to compete with other folks with other hardware. And sometimes hardware in itself, I mean, how much more can a camera, a pixel, be different than another camera pixel? And so the differentiators sometimes are very price sensitive more than it is features and functions, where software can become much more vast, different, and flexible and architected and designed a little faster. And the differentiation can be more profound when you compare one with others. And so, it's a different mindset, but having the hardware also is an advantage because you have a tendency to have it for a longer time. It's something personal, especially mobile phones, where people check their mobile phones. I think somebody mentioned like over 1,000 times a day,
Right. And again, just staying with innovation, discoveries, and so on, do you feel that the education sector lends itself to you could say aggressive patenting or just defensive patenting? Like, is patenting and filing patents something that's worth doing in this field, or you really cannot monopolize ideas which everybody else will probably have anyway?
Yeah, I think it's always good business practice to create patents and licensing enablements for sure. There is clearly much more of an open source feel in education. Things are more shared. It's not like financial services or other commercialized industries where it's all about the IP. There definitely is an appreciation, no doubt, for any business practice. But you know, there's often sometimes those lines can be blurred. People want things free or very reduced price. So I think from patents, yes, it's important. It's just good business practice overall. But I wouldn't always say that, you know, banking your entire investment on this patent only is the most viable thing, because, you know, people invent and reinvent and can alter and change things slightly different. And so just having this one widget and just boxing that in may not be and putting your investments into that only to think that that is the only differentiator may not be the only thing. But yes, having the clear definition of that licensing is important, but not the only thing.
Great. So let's come to Kuvax. And, you know, in the opening remarks, you were saying that, you know, the spectrum of changes and blended learning and all those things, there's so much happening. Where's your mind at? I mean, you know, tell us about how big your company is and what you're doing and how you're addressing this wide spectrum of possibilities.
Yeah, like, and as I said before, I wasn't intended to just come out and try to become this billion-dollar organization. It originally started to be just more philanthropic. I wanted to give back and help. And so I almost have like these three components. I'm advising, doing a little bit of investment, and also advising even larger, we'll call it investment companies. And third, at some point, I'll probably end up building my own product as I start to observe some more specific dynamic gaps I believe that are out there. I've got about 6 or 8 already ed tech companies, and more continue to come in. And really, I've banked like my own thesis and said, what do I believe education will change given all this sort of you know, chaotic environment it may feel like if you are in education. I'd say definitely the reskilling area. So I look for ed techs that I can help, that want and can change in that market. Driving artificial intelligence and using augmented analytics is going to be the wave of the future, and education is very far behind. So those are areas I'd like to see to help, maybe even invest. And thirdly is, again, going down to that rounding out that digital learning environment, everything from AI proctoring type of tools to systems management and those type of areas are other areas. And so all my product, or I'm sorry, the portfolio of companies that I'm investing or helping kind of fall into one of those buckets. And so from there, I either make them the team together or then we go address it. And then once in a while, I'll get an organization like a World Bank or a large school district or an MOE that will want to understand what the future of education will look like. And this is where the consulting advising goes a little bit different, but with the same spirit in mind, and say, hey, these are the 3 areas I think you got to really unearth and change, because nobody really knows what the future of education is going to exactly look like. But I think it's going to be a journey, and that is where Kuvax is, just to try to really accelerate that journey for either institutions or companies themselves.
You mentioned proctoring and accreditation. So about a month back, we had as a guest somebody who runs Examity. Have you heard of Examity?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, exactly, because you know, right now everyone talks about authentic assessments and all that stuff. Well, how do you know mom and dad is not underneath the table? And you didn't think about that because you didn't have to think about that, because everyone knows we're just going to go to take the test in the physical proctored exam at school. Of course, that dynamic changed. And so Examity or Proctor Exam, I think they were just recently acquired by Turnitin. I mean, these are the type of organizations that are now really in good position to fulfill that market in that particular end, for sure.
Got it.
Yeah.
So I'll come back to that. Let me start picking up some of the comments or questions that we're getting. So how can LMS stroke edtech startups compete with larger companies with larger customer databases?
Absolutely. I think it's super important. And as I said before, large organizations are very keen on seeing the market of the innovation that's happening coming out of the new ed techs or these accelerators for sure. I looked at it all the time, and that was a quote from my CEO who told me, keep an eye on them, and we want to invest in them. We want to partner in them. It wasn't so much like we want to fear it and do anything or replicate. It wasn't that type of personality. So I would say, be very clear on your value proposition. It's hard to match a resource to a big company, but it's also hard for a big company to go so deep and know one very vertical into the depths. So master what you offer, keep it very clean on your value proposition. Be customer driven. The closer you are to the customer, understanding the intricacies, I believe is a huge advantage. That's where a company like Amazon always pride. You heard this word customer obsessed by Amazon. It is true. It's not just words that they put on a piece of paper and feel good about it. They always want to diagnose with the customers because that is the market that they want to represent. And be agile. I think larger organizations are not easy to move, even though many of them move a little faster than others. They're still big organizations. So being small, you can hit like some seams and identify some real niche things and offer that much more quickly than a large organizations. And always understand what the big organizations, what they want. Put yourselves in their shoes. They're looking to get the next, collaborative platform out there or the next video. Well, how can your organization assist and maybe help them get there? And that's where I think a good joint value proposition and where teaming can become much more integrated, engaged versus feeling threatened, if that answers your question there.
Oh, sure. I mean, basically you're underlying the quality aspect can trump the quantity aspect,
Absolutely.
Put your brain to it and figure something out.
Yeah.
What's the fundamental difference you found in student teenager learning patterns or abilities during the Alexa years between India, China, and the USA, for example?
The student level, I can't answer that per each student level. I would definitely say at highest level is I felt that a lot of the Eastern and the Asia markets, people were much more quantitatively driven. And it's not a bad thing. It's just much more structured, very strong in those skills. And it's a very generalization where the Western parts of the countries had a little bit more the qualitative type of things. Now those lines are blurring, but I would say infrastructure wise, what was offered technology, and there's common elements, is just connectivity. And I know that sounds so basic, fundamental, but whoever addresses the connectivity, the equalization of the baseline infrastructure, I believe will have a significant head start, number one. Number two, I think all young people are very good at technology. Sometimes the older generations, maybe even myself, TK, are a little slower to adopt. But in Asia, I feel like a lot of the technologies are easy to adopt, even by the older generations, like in China. Many of you have been there. Commerce itself is very mobile driven and very QR code, and that's it. That, I know it sounds so fundamental, but that's not really prevalent here in the Western parts of the world. And that sometimes could be a roadblock of how other things can unleash. So I don't know if I answered your question. It's hard for me to say which student is better, but at least to the infrastructure and how even the overall culture uses technology, I think differentiates about what pervades ultimately in education and what the possibilities are for sure.
I mean, I think there are differences, like you touched upon the natural inclination to be more quantitative in certain cultures versus, you could say, more social or more contextual,
Sure.
right? I mean, that's important. I remember 5-6 years ago, I was running at the time we ran high school, a Saturday school for, entrepreneurship. So I was doing that. And I just threw in a question, who reads fat books anyway? They said, what do you mean? So I said, well, I had a 600-page economics book and a 400-page physics book, and we labored through it. Does anybody read that anymore? They said, no, we don't. So I said, how do you learn? They said, we Google it. I said, okay, so you'll Google something and you'll get 200,000 references. That's worse than a fat book. What do you do? So then they said, we Instagram it. I said, what do you mean you Instagram it? What they do, they have 4 or 5 guys learning together. They're in a group and they select pieces and then they're sharing. And there's a high sharing and high kind of, okay, let's work on this together. So that's one change that I'm sure is still the case.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I noticed is that the attention spans are a lot less. I'm sure you've noticed that too.
I think that's for all kids. Yeah, I think, yes, because everything is distracted now, right? It's I would say one university about distraction used to be known as a party school. And they go, and then they did everything to drive, and they go, but their study showed it wasn't because of their efforts. It's because the attention span for students were around phones now. Like 10, 15 years ago, not about everybody had this. And so they said, well, other habits of partying have declined, but other challenges have increased. So anxiety, social emotional awareness have actually increased in some instances. So yeah, it's not everything is perfected, TK, but you're absolutely right. Even just student learning and how they learn and how they absorb information is very different than what you and I grew up with, indeed. And that is, a lot of it's prevalent to the affordability of devices and the connectivity and all the information and the socialness of all of what's happened on the internet.
I mean, this ties to a comment somebody made that people are checking their phones 1,000 times a day, right?
Uh-huh.
And nobody's going to have a solution for that except themselves.
Yeah.
But to kind of use that phenomenon, again, I keep going back to previous speakers. I mean, this forum has been very educational for a lot of us. And we had a neuroscientist, and the neuroscientist was making the comments that there's deep study going on how people learn, whether students or adults. And they're, the observational capabilities, the non-invasive, where are the synapses firing and how are they firing and the depth of the fire and all of that. So they've started cataloging all of that. Mm. And they're saying that one of the big things is experiential learning is the thing, right? So if you read something, you understand so much, but if you do that thing, of course, we all know that, but they're kind of trying to put that into action. And I think, so if somebody is checking their iPhone 1,000 times a day, somebody would have to be creative and say, well, those touch points, every 50 touch points do something, right? Yeah. Every 50 touch points create something. And guess who's already doing that? Gamers, game designers.
Yep.
I think it's fascinating how they keep you engaged. They give you a challenge. Yep. They force you to take an action, and they either beat you up or give you a reward.
Right.
And just inevitable that that's going to happen more and more within education, don't you think?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of gaming and learning. Jane McGonigal, I've had her as one of my guest speakers almost 10 years ago at Microsoft. And she authored one of those books, and she studied about gaming and learning. And what was phenomenal is absolutely you can test your competencies in a non-threatening, pressured way that's fun. You still have pressure to win, but it's something you're enjoying. But also the other element, TK, is it's okay to fail, right? You get back up and you try again, but we don't have that type of element when it comes to some high stakes examination, right? You just fail once and then you might have to wait 6 months, a year, whatever, or maybe never to take that again. And so I think it's a different type of way of learning is, yes, it's experiential, hands-on. It's something more engaging through an act of a game, something that's fun and enjoyable. And you pick yourself back up and you learn, you retraining yourself. If you made a mistake this way, then maybe try a different pattern. And so I think there's other elements and other learning objectives that you achieve through something like gaming is for sure. So it's a huge fan of that, no doubt. Absolutely.
So while we were talking about enjoyment and fun, I'll come back to that, but I've got another question, so let's do that first.
Absolutely.
What kind of advice do you regularly share with startup companies finding new channel geographies?
Okay, well, I mean, channel geography from countries, I would first say is, have you mastered the one that you're in today first? Because it's, my mother always used to say, your eyes may be bigger than your stomach can handle. And every entrepreneur, like there's always this grand vision of changing the world in a very profound way. Awesome. But also be mindful, have you mastered that first vertical, first channel geography, whether it's the US or in India or in China? Have you really mastered that to a certain degree where you're ready to take on a whole new investment, a whole new area of marketing and driving into new areas? That would be number one. Number two, do you have the right partnerships or on the ground, if you will? And that's more metaphorically, because, being in person used to have and be a must before you go into any country. Nowadays, it's a little less as challenging, even though I would recommend you still have that. But do you have and understand that new geography as well? And in those geographies, even though we're in a worldwide economy and technology offering, there's still very much niche players that have certain things. So what may be your partners and competition in one market may be vastly different in others. So you just need to understand that landscape and understand what your goals are going to be, why that one, and why, and how do you see the path for success there, and clearly articulate it. Can't be like, oh, there's 100 million over there. We can just sell it there. I've seen too many mistakes occur, and then you end up again diversifying your focus. You split up your focus, you split up your investments, and then you get watered down. Those are the positives and negatives.
That's so important to recognize. We talked about short attention spans, wanting to learn through experience, but assuming you've got the quality part figured out and you've got quality service or product, focus on that one market and get it right.
Get it right.
And that doesn't happen by, floating around or jumping around like a butterfly on things, right? You got to stick with it, get really into it. That is so important. And that's probably one of the things about entrepreneurship, like the staying power, the focus, the energy, the team around you, lots of things there. I just see a note, somebody's put a comment, Perspect AI. I'll make a note of that. Assessment tool based on gaming. So yeah, obviously there's a lot happening in this space anyway.
Yeah.
So while we're waiting for any more questions, as a kid, of course, we all read comics, Batman, Superman, and different superheroes. And one of my favorites was The Flash.
Okay.
Remember The Flash?
I do. DC
like
Comics.
lightning speed. Right. Okay. So you've got a bunch of action figures. Which one would you be?
Well, you can't see. I can move. There's Wolverine in the middle, right there, the little gentleman. And I'm a comic book geek. I didn't think this would get so much attention, but that was like, people really like comic books. So I like Wolverine because he was scrappy. He's not the most prettiest, elegant of individuals, but he's scrappy. He's a little rough looking, but he never finishes until it's done. And so I don't know why I like him, but he's also a little tough little sucker. He's not a tall individual, but he gets a lot of respect. He's not the most strongest superpower, but he's a little too aggressive, I would say, maybe for education, but he's unrelenting. And then that's what I like about him. As small as he is, he's ferocious. He gets it. And once in a while, he has a kind heart. I don't know if that's me. That's probably not the same analogy, but that's one of the individuals I became fond of. I'm not always a fan of the movies, but growing up, he was always, and has been, and always will be my favorite character for sure.
Now, like a cat, does a Wolverine have the ability to pull the claws back in, or are they always out?
You know what? It's a good question. I think in the comics, yes, but I don't know about the actual real animal. I've never had my pleasure or of meeting a real Wolverine, but probably don't look forward to that if I do. But yes, that's an interesting and a good comment. I probably should study what an actual Wolverine can and cannot do as well.
So, I mean, I know these are just a bit of banter and throwaway lines, but in reality, making analogies with, characters or personas,
Mhm.
I find that so important when trying to build a team,
Yeah.
right? And then, in team building, I mean, we're all humans, right? So you could ascribe a characteristic on me, and
Mhm.
then I might selectively decide to deploy it, right? So
Yep.
when you want me to deploy that skill, I may not be bringing it in, right? And there's a whole human algorithm that has to go on, which you can never put on a piece of paper. It's just
Yeah.
fascinating, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit it on that. These are the things that you don't read about in books or until, and that's not even about being an entrepreneur, just knowing how to maneuver and manage a team to its most potential is leverage the strengths of people. And I know that sounds, again, so book and sophomoric, but it's true. Don't try to force people to do what they're not good at. Double down on what they're good at. Some of them are good in front of customers. Put them in a customer success role, but they're not probably a good product person. Like a product person needs to hit deadlines and have some creativity, but make sure products are released. They may not always be the best in front of customers, so don't try to force that. So, yeah, high performing teams and a good leader, I guess, knows how to really optimize those and fine tune that element, to your point,
Right.
TK, for sure. And that's important, especially when you're small. You can't afford to have 20% of them not do the right thing.
And maybe this is what kind of triggered one of the points there. What are the skill sets would be most sought in the future that you notice in your previous roles?
The most basic thing I would say is having the ability to get it done. I know we just need people who can take an action and get things done. Um, it's very easy to fall into the analysis paralysis, whether you're in a big company or small company. People like to study things. People like to be perfect. Get it done. I mean, even what I would say, what makes Amazon different than many other big companies. And the other big companies have the same elements, so I shouldn't say that way. But I was very, very impressed with certain companies who really put a premium on that. Okay, just get it done. Get it done. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just get it done. Good is the enemy of the perfect. Good enough is the enemy of perfect, and often good enough can get you
The
a long way and be
right,
successful.
so
Yeah.
yeah, got it. I mean, yeah, that whole in itself is another. I mean,
Another session.
another session. I mean, I don't want to be rude to anybody, but I kind of remember in the early days of Microsoft, it's what I call the Bill Gates approach to product release. Get it sort of out quickly, and then let the market fix it up for you, right?
Yeah.
Um, it worked, right?
Yeah.
Do we like it? No, but I mean, it happens.
I used to joke around to that point. And no disrespect to Microsoft, beautiful, incredible company, did very well. And wait till version 3 is what I used to joke around for Microsoft, because they get
Right.
it right, though. They do, but not releasing it. And think about that. If you couldn't release quickly enough and trying to think perfect, you'd never get a product out, you know?
Right.
And that is, and always the best product doesn't always win. That's another big important point. Get it? Otherwise, we would have been watching Betamax for VHS for the older, younger entrepreneurs. Betamax was a superior product than VHS, but it
Right.
didn't win because the marketing, the distributions, all those things weren't there.
Good. Well, we've got no more questions, and I think we've had a very content-rich conversation. So thank you really for sharing a lot of your insights and background, and where you think the educational investment and opportunities are. So I would like to wrap up and just go on to some closing comments that I have to make. But thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate the time. I hope it was helpful, and it's always an honor. And if there's any questions, I can always leave my contact information if you need to reach me. Thank you very much, TK.
Great. And just for our attendees, we had a very mini survey done. I got some responses, but somehow we have to get higher engagement, which through the questions works. But one idea is that we will be doing a kind of a mini entrepreneurship clinic. So if there are people who have questions or are stuck with something, they can bring the questions, and a few of the committee members will have a session dedicated to one or more of such items in the clinic. We've got to work some details out, but watch this space, and we're going to be developing that. So with that, thank you very much, Andrew. I shall reach out to you again offline. We'll stay in touch, and wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, TK.
Bye-bye.